He's also trying to rally the Saudis and the Gulf states, along with Israel, to stand together against terrorism and extremism and to stand up against a common foe, Iran. The president left Riyadh 15 hours ago for another historic leg of this trip. We begin our coverage there with Chief White House correspondent John Roberts traveling with the president in Jerusalem tonight. Hello, John.
Bret, good evening to you. So far, the president's first foreign trip, and this one to the Middle East, has been a success, signing new economic and military cooperation deals, recruiting new help in the war on terror, even stoking new optimism of a Mideast peace deal. About the only departure from the script happened earlier today here in Jerusalem. It was one of those unscripted moments, a shouted question from the press that creates a headline. When Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu weighed in on reports President Trump shared Israeli intelligence with Russia.
Intelligence cooperation is terrific.
In an extraordinary moment, President Trump stopped his aides from shooing the press out of the room, demanding a moment to clear the air.
Just so you understand, I never mentioned the word or the name Israel. Never mentioned it during the conversation. They were all saying I did. So you had to know the story wrong. Never mentioned the word Israel.
But it was never reported that President Trump told the Russians that the intelligence was from Israel. The press only said that one of the threats President Trump described to Russia's foreign minister was a product of Israeli intelligence. The Russia flap did not appear to derail the hearty welcome President Trump received when he touched down in Israel. President Reuven Rivlin welcoming new engagement from the United States.
Mr. President, we are happy to see that America is back in the area. America is back again.
Israel is clearly pleased with the change in posture from the Obama administration. Cool indifference has been replaced by the familiar warmth between old friends.
I want you to know how much we appreciate the change in American policy on Iran, which you enunciated so clearly just an hour ago. I want you to know how much we appreciate your bold decision to act against the use of chemical weapons in Syria.
The visit so far has been rife with symbolism. President Trump visiting the holiest site in the Christian faith, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and becoming the first sitting president to visit one of Judaism's holiest sites, the Western Wall, where, according to tradition, the president said a prayer and tucked a note between the blocks. The president is under no illusion that it would be easy, but he today insisted conditions may never have been better than now to finally forge a Middle East peace.
We must take advantage of the situation, and there are many, many things that can happen now that would never have been able to happen before, and we understand that very well.
The difference is an increasingly emboldened Iran, seen by Israel and much of the Sunni Arab world as an existential threat. In a speech in Saudi Arabia yesterday, President Trump urged the leaders of some 50 majority Muslim nations to unite against Iran and the broader threat of terrorism.
Drive them out of your places of worship. Drive them out of your communities. Drive them out of your holy land. And drive them out of this earth.
Tomorrow morning, the president travels to Bethlehem to meet with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, and it really does look like the atmosphere here is beginning to shift. I'm told that there have been a lot of below-the-radar direct contacts between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and earlier today, the president made the first publicized direct flight between Riyadh and Tel Aviv. Some very important symbolism in that flight. Bret?
Exactly. John Roberts, live in Jerusalem, traveling with the president. John, thank you. One of the president's themes during the trip, uniting America and its allies around common goals, as you just heard. I spoke with the president's national security advisor about that before Air Force One took that historic journey to Israel to get H.R. McMaster's assessment of the key takeaways here and also a look ahead. General, thanks for the time.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here with you.
You've seen the world reaction to the president's speech. You're leaving here. What's your assessment of this first stop?
Well, it's really been incredibly positive. What we're coming out of Saudi Arabia with is a common understanding of this threat that we face, that all civilized people face. And based on that common understanding, we're now ready to move forward with common action against terrorist organizations, against the people that finance them, and against that extremist ideology that lays a foundation for terrorists to draw on. So I think it's amazingly positive. The key will be the follow-up. Everybody understands that. And now we have the agreements in place that we need to move forward together.
David Axelrod, former senior advisor to President Obama, tweeted, "We must abandon human rights to fight terrorism. The lack of one helps fuel the other, and ignoring violations weakens the U.S. in the eyes of the world." Your reaction to that, and did the president bring up human rights in these private meetings?
Well, everything was about human rights. The entire trip is about human rights, about all civilized people coming together to fight the hatred, those who foment hatred, those who then try to justify violence against innocent people. So what can be more human rights than that? So you'll see this carry through the entire trip. You're going to see us talk about, the president really talk about human rights in Israel and the need for the Israelis and the Palestinians to come to an accommodation that removes the basis for violence there. He's going to go to Rome and then talk about the need for people of all religions to come together against this threat to all of our societies. And so the entire trip, you could say, is about human rights.
I guess he was specifically talking about the Saudis and the questions about their human rights. Was it brought up privately?
Well, I think what you have here is the beginning of an incredibly close relationship that can serve as a basis to move forward in a number of areas, including human rights. And if you look at the president's speech, there's a very clear passage in there about the Saudi commitment to move forward in this area, and this is what America is going to encourage. I mean, I think this is a very pragmatic view on the part of the president, but a view that's informed by our desire to advance human rights broadly.
A couple more things. You were the person who fought to change or soften the tone a little bit on the radical Islamic terrorism, and in exchange for Islamist extremism. The president, in the speech, used Islamic terrorism and asked about that. A senior official, I was at a backgrounder, said that he's just a, quote, exhausted guy. I emceed an event where the president was supposed to address the crowd at the end at this Tweeps event, and at the last minute sent Ivanka instead. Is the president okay?
No, I've never seen the president exhausted, actually. I think some of us get exhausted trying to keep pace with him. But if you look at the pace of this trip, it's unbelievable, right? And so the key on the phrase, what we call it, right, what we mean, how our understanding, what is our understanding of this problem is more important than the label. But what the president understands and what he talked about through the whole speech is these are not Islamic people. These are not religious people. These are people who use a perverted interpretation of religion to advance their criminality, to advance a political agenda. And you saw great agreement on that in all the speeches yesterday. King Salman used almost the same language. And so the president listens to his fellow leaders and his partners and revises his understanding and then uses that understanding to drive us forward on a common agenda.
So he's not exhausted.
He's not exhausted.
All right.
Some of us wish he was exhausted.
You're heading to Israel, and there are some sticky issues. Your expectations?
I think our expectations are that the president is going to reach out to our greatest ally, to reassure our greatest ally of our unshakable bond to that alliance, and the unshakable bond with the Israeli people, but also to understand and help others understand that there must be a way forward on a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and to use that as a basis for also new partnerships in the region. And what you'll hear through the whole trip is really we all share common threats. We all share common opportunities. Let's work together, Israel, the Arab states, to help shape that future in a positive direction, to get off this path toward hatred and violence, get on the path toward peace and prosperity.
One of the sticky issues is the intel sharing controversy. Publicly, the Israelis are very supportive. Privately, there are serious concerns about that and what the president said to the Russians. How will you deal with that in the meetings in Israel?
Well, I think what you see is very strong confidence that has not been affected by any recent events or the news about recent events, and that's going to continue. The relationship that we've had for many, many years, and in recent years in particular.
John, well, we appreciate the time.
Thanks, Bret. Great to be with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the overall impact of this trip, the policy and the politics. Senior political analyst Bret is in Washington tonight. Good evening, Bret. I want to start off by taking it 30,000 feet. As you look at these images broadly before we get into the nitty-gritty here, your impressions of this trip so far?
Well, Bret, it has been the case very often in recent years that when a president went off on a foreign trip, his departure would be noted and there would be coverage, but nothing like the extravaganza that we've seen over this past weekend. This fanfare that accompanied the visit to Saudi Arabia, the extent of the welcome, while it wasn't quite the show in Israel today that it was in Saudi Arabia, another warm welcome as well. And it frames the president, this president in particular, in a somewhat different light than we'd been seeing him when he was struggling with the controversies that are swirling around his presidency in Washington. Now he's off doing the business of the presidency, the unmistakable business that only a president does. And I don't see any way around the fact that it's going to help him, at least in the near term. While he might have been able to do the sword dance a little bit more effectively, he still looked good in this atmosphere and in the actions that he carried out over there.
Yeah, striking the Saudis and what all of them said, and we're going to talk to another Saudi cabinet member a little bit later in the show, and then the King of Saudi Arabia. But listen to the Prime Minister of Israel with the President today.
America welcomes the action and support of any nation willing to do the hard but vital work in eradicating the violent ideologies that have caused so much needless bloodshed and killing here and all over the world.
Common dangers are turning former enemies into partners. And that's where we see something new and potentially something very promising. For the first time in my lifetime, I see a real hope for change.
You know, Bret, I've been on a lot of foreign trips. You've been on many more than I have. To hear leaders talk like that in two different places like Israel and Saudi Arabia is striking. It
is striking, Bret, and it does raise the possibility that there could be at least a kind of détente between many of the Muslim countries and Israel. Saudi Arabia appears to be a good candidate for that. John Roberts pointed out the symbolism of the president flying from Riyadh directly into Israel, and that is not without meaning in a setting like this. So I think, you know, there's reason for hope here, and of course the size of that summit with 50 Muslim nations gathered there in common purpose, and the president leading them with a speech that seems to have been quite well received, obviously fits into that as well. So, you know, so far so good, it seems to me, just looking at it in terms of the impact of the trip, and especially politically here at home.
But very quickly, Bret, now to the nitty-gritty. When the president steps up and says reporters don't leave the room, I never said the word Israel about that story, about what he told the Russians in the Oval Office. Does that step on what is a pretty good message overall for the past 3 days?
Well, it certainly was picked up this afternoon here in Washington by the news media, who's, you know, on the air all day long, and pointed to as a kind of a blunder. CNN was noting that, for example, no one had ever reported, and I guess John Roberts said the same thing, no one had ever reported that Israel was the source. But as you recall, Bret, there were a multitude of source reports that said this did indeed come from Israel. The problem, of course, with what the president says was that it appeared to confirm that. That's obviously not what he intended, because he was thinking, as he so often does, about himself and whether he was to blame, but I think that was the effect of it. So these are the kinds of things that when the president sticks to his script, he avoids, and when he doesn't, he doesn't.
All right, Bret, as always, thank you.
You bet, Bret.
Well, what do you think of the president's trip so far? Let me know on Twitter at Bret Baier. Use the hashtag Special Report, or on Facebook at facebook.com/BretBaierSR. Back in the U.S., some breaking news. The president's former national security advisor has told a congressional committee he will not be cooperating for now. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has the latest on that story tonight.
Citing his Fifth Amendment protections, former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and his legal team said in a letter to the Senate Intelligence Committee they would not provide records despite a congressional subpoena. Given the political heat and the FBI case, legal experts said it's a sound strategy, but may only buy Flynn time because a special counsel has broad powers.
People want to make a big deal out of it, like somebody asserting their privilege must be hiding something. And that often isn't the case. They're just listening to a competent lawyer who tells them that you should have protections.
Flynn's decision seems to underscore concerns on Capitol Hill about naming former FBI Director Robert Mueller as special counsel.
One of the results of that, the ability of Congress to call people who may be witnesses in an investigation conducted by Mr. Mueller, is going to severely restrict what we can do.
Two members of the Trump election team, former campaign chairman Paul Manafort and political advisor Roger Stone, have reportedly provided documents to the Senate committee. Former FBI Director James Comey has agreed to testify before the same Senate panel after Memorial Day. A senior Democrat, Senator Dianne Feinstein, said she will press Comey on this recent exchange.
If the Attorney General or senior officials at the Department of Justice opposes a specific investigation, can they halt that FBI investigation?
In theory, yes.
Has it happened?
Not in my experience, because it would be a big deal to tell the FBI to stop doing something that without an appropriate purpose.
On the House side, the Intelligence Committee is reportedly focused on former Trump campaign aide Michael Caputo, seeking his testimony as well as records. On the Sunday political shows, the Republican leading a separate investigation said his focus is Comey's memos documenting meetings with President Trump.
I don't even know that the Department of Justice has them. Maybe Director Comey has them. I don't know where they reside. I don't know if they are documents, but we're certainly pursuing them.
Chaffetz spoke with Comey late today, telling Fox News the former FBI director wants to talk with the special counsel prior to public testimony, as committee Democrats allege Flynn may have lied to security clearance investigators by not fully disclosing the source of his Russian payments. Bret.
Catherine, thank you. The Trump administration and House Republicans are asking a federal appeals court for a 90-day extension in a case casting a shadow of uncertainty over health insurance for millions of customers and consumers. It involves federal funds insurers use to lower deductibles and co-payments for people with modest incomes purchasing individual policies under Obamacare. About $7 billion are at stake here. Critics say dragging out the case could drive premiums higher next year. The U.S. Supreme Court has struck down 2 congressional districts in North Carolina, saying race played too big a part in their creation. The court said the GOP-controlled state legislature put too many African Americans in the 2 districts, thereby weakening the black influence elsewhere. Those districts, though, had already been redrawn, and the new map was in effect during last year's elections. A good start to the markets in the U.S. today. The Dow jumped 90, the S&P 500 was up 12, the Nasdaq gained 50. Now more on a story we first told you about last Friday. If it feels like media coverage of the Donald Trump presidency has been incredibly negative so far, there are some numbers to back that up tonight. Researchers at Harvard have put it in writing. Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media Buzz, Howard Kurtz, has the specifics from Washington. Good evening, Howie.
Good evening, Bret. The constant barrage of criticism is inescapable.
Donald Trump now sits at the threshold of impeachment.
We need to be very clear. If anyone else in the government disclosed information like this to the Russians as described, it would be a crime and that person would go to jail.
No politician in history, and I say this with great surety, has been treated worse or more unfairly.
A new study now supports the president's claim. Harvard's Shorenstein Center has some startling findings on major media coverage of the president's first 100 days. 80% of stories with a clear tone were negative, only 20% positive. And that's twice as negative as the comparable coverage for Barack Obama. Now, the level of criticism varies issue by issue. Immigration, 96% negative. Fitness for office, 81% negative. Trump's best subject, the economy, 54% negative. The breakdown by news organization is rather revealing. On CNN and NBC, coverage of the president was 93% negative. CBS just slightly behind at 91% negative. The major newspapers, the New York Times, 87% negative. Washington Post, 83%. That drops down to 70% for the Wall Street Journal. The study cited Fox News as the most balanced organization, 52% negative, 48% positive. Researchers looked at each network's main newscast, in this case, Special Report. The negativity echoes even louder for this reason. Donald Trump drew 3 times as much coverage on national TV as previous presidents, featured in more than 4 out of every 10 stories. Now, Trump critics say the coverage is more negative because this president is more divisive and his associates are under investigation by Congress, the FBI, now a special counsel. But with 3 networks so slanted based on this Harvard study that fewer than 1 in 10 stories has anything positive to say about the president, some self-examination might be in order. Bret?
Howie, thank you. The Homeland Security Department says nearly 740,000 foreigners who were supposed to leave the U.S. during a recent 12-month period are overstaying their visas. That's up about 200,000 from the previous period. But these new figures include students not included in the last year's report. An estimated 40% of the roughly 11 million people in the U.S. illegally. Welcome back to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and special report coverage of the president's Middle East trip. Tonight, he's in Israel. This weekend, he spent here in Riyadh. One of the cornerstones of his 2 days in the kingdom, finishing up a huge weapons deal with the Saudis, added to the tens of billions of dollars of Saudi investment in U.S. companies. Correspondent Rich Edson at the State Department tells us what's in the agreement.
President Trump chose Saudi Arabia as his first international destination, and this as his message to Arab leaders.
America is prepared to stand with you in pursuit of shared interests and common security. But the nations of the Middle East cannot wait for American power to crush this enemy for them.
And to facilitate that, the Trump administration has approved billions in arms sales to Saudi Arabia, $110 billion immediately, $350 billion over 10 years. The Obama administration halted some of those sales over concerns the Saudi military would strike civilians, while it intervenes in the fighting in neighboring Yemen.
Saudi Arabia is one of the 10 most repressive countries in the world, and for Trump to signal that this was the top, one of the most important foreign countries, one of the most important foreign relationships he sees, is a real striking shift in tone and approach.
The United States and Saudi Arabia are celebrating a stronger relationship with the U.S. under President Donald Trump, with the U.S. stressing more confrontation with Iran and less intrusion in internal Arab affairs.
We are not here to tell other people how to live, what to do, who to be, or how to worship. Instead, we are here to offer partnership based on shared interests and values to pursue a better future.
To some advocates, a troubling signal the U.S. is less interested in defending human rights.
We continue to discuss with the Saudis the importance of continuing to expand the rights of women in their society. They are addressing those at a pace that I think they feel they can manage. We're never going to, back off of our pressure on them.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was also asked about President Trump's negative comments towards Islam and Saudi Arabia during the campaign. Tillerson says the president's and Americans' views will continue to evolve and that we need to do a better job of trying to understand one another's culture and beliefs. Bret?
Rich Edson, live at the State Department. Rich, thank you. Now some insight from a member of the Saudi cabinet. I talked with Minister of State Mohammed al-Sheikh and started by asking about the reaction to President Trump's historic first stop here in the kingdom.
It's extremely positive. I mean, the visit, for President Trump to decide to visit Saudi Arabia, make it his first destination outside of the United States, and for him to meet with the leaders of over 50 Muslim nations and give his speech in front of them, that was a historic moment yesterday. He talked about, shared values, and he talked about working together with the countries of this part of the world and the Muslim countries to try to have a better future for everybody around the world, to work with each other and to combat terrorism and extremism, to really have, again, a brighter future for our people. I mean, this is a very old relationship. We are probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, ally and partner of the United States. It's been about an 8 or 9 decade relationship. So the fact that he chose us signifies, the importance of Saudi Arabia in this part of the world, but also to the United States.
So is this visit by President Trump a game changer for U.S.-Saudi relations, for U.S. relations with the Gulf nations?
Having selected Saudi Arabia as his first destination, everything that was discussed over the last 2 days, everything that was announced over the last 2 days is truly a game changer.
A lot of Americans may not have seen the full translation of the King's speech, but he was very forward-leaning on signing on to this fighting extremism and terrorism. I guess I'm wondering if you acknowledge that there is skepticism at home in the U.S. About this, whether it's actually going to come to pass.
It actually is, Bret, and we've been actually, fighting and combating terrorism for a very long time. We have had, unfortunately, hundreds of events. We thwarted even hundreds more over the last couple of decades, and we have been the victims, and the whole world has been the victim of terrorism. So we are very serious about this.
Talk about human rights here. You have a plan called Vision 2030, which is not only changing Saudi Arabia economically, but also socially. Talk about that.
Vision 2030 is truly a vision and a plan to change the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Its basis, its foundation is economic change, but there's also social aspects to it. We are sending our daughters to school, we're educating them, and now we're really focusing on increasing their participation in the labor market.
I emceed this event, Tweeps 2017, and listened to some fascinating panels about fighting extremism through social media. Princess Rima bint Bandar Al Saud, Vice President, Women's Affairs, General Sports Authority.
It is a social disconnect that allows you to believe that you have the right to take somebody else's life and that your life could possibly be more valuable than theirs. To create that disconnect is a shocking disconnect. That is a mental health disorder. What we're talking about is saying, if you need to go that far to have a sense of community, what other sense of community could we give you?
Princess Rima today is a senior government official, and we have today chairmen of significant companies in the kingdom that are females. We have CEOs of financial institutions and other institutions that are females. There has been a lot that has been accomplished over the last, but
they still can't drive.
But there's still also a lot that we will try to accomplish, and we are committing to accomplish over the next decade under Vision 2030. When you talk about driving, I mean, driving was an issue that probably 10, 15 years ago was taboo. Today it's being discussed in the media, it's being discussed in the government, it's being discussed in all areas and by all concerned. It is a social issue, and we just have to accept that when we're ready, it will happen. But we have come a long way just on the debate on women driving locally in the kingdom, and ultimately, I'm sure it's going to happen.
Economically, you're trying to shift.
Yes.
Away from a dependence on oil.
Yes.
This arms deal is massive with the U.S. that the President and the King signed. That is transformational in some way?
It is transformational. It is different than other deals in the past, because this time there's actually going to be a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of technology. There's going to be a huge manufacturing sector, and part of this deal is going to be manufactured locally in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
You have a young population.
Very young.
I mean, really young.
True.
What is it, 70%?
Over 70% of the population is actually under the age of 30 years old.
70%?
Yes.
So that education and the social media and all of that is playing a big role in those young people.
Absolutely. I mean, you have, again, this population that has a much longer time horizon for, how far out they're looking. They're looking 10, 15, 20 years out. They want to make sure that they get proper education. They want to make sure that once they actually get their degrees, they do find jobs, and they want to have the same opportunities that their parents had when they actually went through life. And that's why we're looking at change. And we want to make sure that that generation and that 70% of our population, which is the majority of our population is not subject to the volatilities of oil prices, and we are not dependent on oil revenues going forward.
For skeptical Americans who sit here and maybe look at the kingdom and with well, they're scared of the past. What do you say to them? They say that they're worried about this massive arms deal. They're worried about the possibility that it's not all coming together, and they're worried about human rights.
I'd say to them, you know, Bret, if you look at the number of Saudis who actually were, just the U.S. alone, I'm not talking about any other country, the number of Saudis who were actually lived in the U.S., educated in the U.S., you know, I received a degree from a U.S. university. My wife actually graduated from a U.S. university. Hundreds of thousands of Saudis were actually educated in the U.S. and they experienced the U.S. culture, and they're coming back. And if you look at the youth and their connection with the world today, it truly is a different world for everybody. Anybody who's been coming to Saudi Arabia over the last 10, 15 years can really see the change that we have achieved over the last decade, but hopefully over the next decade.
I've heard it's one of the toughest deals of all, but I have a feeling that we're going to get there eventually. I hope. There's a lot of love out there, and people from all nations, even nations that you would be surprised to hear, they want to stop the killing. They've had enough.
We are happy to see that America is back in the area. America is back again.
For the first time in my lifetime, I see a real hope for change.
Well, there's a lot of love in Israel for President Trump as he continues his Middle East trip. Taking a trip, Air Force One, from Riyadh here in Saudi Arabia. A historic journey flying directly into Tel Aviv. The first time we can track that a flight landed directly from an Arab nation to Israel. This as there is all kinds of reaction here in Saudi Arabia as well. And much of it, as you've heard tonight, positive. Let's bring in our panel from Washington. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief for the Weekly Standard. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. And we welcome back Ron Fournier, publisher and editor of Crane's Detroit Business and author of Love That Boy, now out in paperback. Ron, I'm going to start with you. You've been in Detroit. How would Detroit look at this trip as it stands right now?
It depends if you're talking about Detroit or northern Michigan. And in Detroit, anything Donald Trump does is going to be looked at negatively. But the state as a whole, you know, I think most people are going to look at this as so far a pretty solid trip. He's mainly stayed on script, which you want most of your presidents to do overseas. The one time he steps outside of the script, he kind of stumbled there. He's you know, been received very warmly. He's been touching all the right buttons. I think it's a trip that so far, overall, when you step back, will be received fairly. He's got the hardest steps ahead of him yet, though. That's obvious.
Steve?
Yeah, I think it's been a good trip for President Trump. I mean, what he's done, most importantly, has been a major reset. I mean, he's signaled in a number of different ways that the Obama administration really is over, that this is a new president. He's got a new agenda. He's embraced Israel. Certainly, we heard during the campaign that he would do that. He's made that abundantly clear now that the hostility and suspicion that Israel was treated with by the Obama administration is now over. And importantly, he spent a good bit of his speech yesterday talking about Iran and the threat from Iran. He talked about Iran as the world's leading state sponsor of terror, something that President Obama was reluctant to do for 8 years in pursuit of the nuclear deal. So all of the rest of this, it seems to me, is details. Those two big things have signaled a change, and I think it's a welcome change.
Yeah, it is the connective tissue here between Israel and Saudi Arabia, Molly. And I asked the foreign minister here about that arms deal, which there are some Democrats, some others concerned about the massive size of this arms deal to Saudi Arabia. Here was his answer about that.
This is going to be incredibly vital to the security of Saudi Arabia, to the security of the region. It will be a great deterrent factor for any country, especially Iran, that thinks it can engage in aggressive behavior against us. And it will also be tremendously beneficial to the United States to know that its allies have the capability to defend themselves.
And again, linking there to Iran. Molly?
It is a significant deal. It bolsters the development of Saudi Arabia. It gives a ton of new jobs to the United States. It brings Saudi Arabia, presumably, into the fight against both ISIS and Iran. And it all is part of this foreign policy vision that Donald Trump laid out in his speech in Riyadh of principled realism. This is a really new direction in foreign policy, rejecting both the lecturing and the moralism of the Obama era, as well as the poorly designed or poorly implemented invasions of both the Obama era and the Bush era. This is a radical change, and we're starting to get a little bit more understanding of how it looks.
Ron, a lot of the coverage has noted that the President Trump, who spoke over the weekend here in Riyadh to the 50-plus leaders from Muslim and Arab nations, sounded a lot different than the candidate Trump on the campaign trail. I asked the National Security Advisor McMaster about this.
The president listens to his fellow leaders and his partners and revises his understanding and then uses that understanding to drive us forward on a common agenda.
Okay, so is this a new President Trump? Is he evolving? What is your sense?
I don't think there is a new President Trump. It's kind of hard to evolve when you're 70 years old. He had a very harsh attitude towards Muslims in the campaign when it suited his purpose. He had a more moderate approach to the Muslim world on this trip when it suits his purpose. So it would be interesting to see what happens when he comes back home, when events change, when his mood changes, and he gets back on Twitter 2 weeks from now.
Okay, Steve, he wasn't on Twitter, or he hasn't been so far on this trip, but there was this moment that we referenced earlier with Bret Hume, where he kept the reporters in the room, the White House press pool, and wanted to say that he did not mention Israel when he was talking to the Russians in the Oval Office.
Yeah, it was an unforced error. He should have just let it go. He was having a good moment. He had his trip is off to a good start. He should have just let it go, and he jumped in and seemed to confirm something that people hadn't reported, or dispute something that people hadn't reported, thereby, in effect, confirming the other stuff. I think, again, this is a small moment in what's otherwise been a bigger trip. What's clear, I think, is that President Trump has made obvious to everybody who he's not and what he's not. I don't think it's as clear as Molly does that he's set forth who he is and what he'll do. I think the biggest challenge with respect to the region and the challenges that he faces there on terrorism, on jihadism, what have you, is an internal challenge from President Trump, because he's said repeatedly that he is not going to get into various wars. He is a sort of instinctive non-interventionist, but it's going to take American leadership, and strong American leadership, in order to accomplish the things that he said he's going to accomplish, most specifically defeating ISIS, rolling back Al-Qaeda, and killing the people who are trying to kill us.
All right, Molly, just to clarify, there have been reports from senior sources, Israeli sources, about that it was Israel behind it, but no reporting that he actually said Israel to the Russians, just to clarify that. But your sense of this, in the big picture, is it going to get washed over by all of the big things on this trip?
It seems like the media are frequently like dogs in the presence of squirrels, and you just need to not give them more squirrels to get distracted by. But this is overall much more important. There are much more significant things going on. The optimism that these Israeli leaders are talking about is really quite striking. Saying that they're Benjamin Netanyahu saying he's more optimistic than he's ever been in his life, and even Arab leaders are saying that they think Donald Trump is uniquely positioned to do the impossible. I think everyone should keep their expectations in check, but that's much more important than the distraction of the day.
We will talk about all of this, and is President Trump getting a respite this week on this trip from overwhelmingly negative media? Story of a possible explosion in the UK at an Ariana Grande concert, I should say. Not a lot of details at this point. Our own Shepard Smith in New York is following this story. If we get the breaking details, we'll give them to you here, and we'll take you to New York with Shep. At that, we'll keep you updated on that breaking story out of the UK. We're back with our panel. One of the things that has been a big topic has been the coverage of not only this trip, but also this presidency. Take a listen to some of it.
I think his trip so far has been excellent.
He actually sounded presidential.
You may agree or disagree with what he said, but he sounded like a president.
The administration was looking for a reboot. They were looking for a chance to change the subject, quite frankly, and they did that indeed with this speech today.
Very diplomatic and measured and sober, and that's what I think we're going to see as well in Israel.
Well, that sounds all very positive. Harvard has come out with a new study about media coverage in the first 100 days, and it shows this. It shows that the coverage is overwhelmingly negative, if you may have thought that. There are numbers behind this. 93% for the biggest negative coverage, U.S. news outlets, according to Harvard. And also, if you put in comparison to other presidents, President Trump at 80% negative, and you see President Obama at 41%. Back with the panel. Ron, obviously there has been a lot to cover, and it's been fast and furious, but your thoughts on these numbers and the coverage?
Well, first, remember, as you know, Bret, our journalist's job aren't to create false equivalencies. We're supposed to cover what happens. You don't want to have a false 50-50 for any president. So when I looked at these numbers, I thought, boy, thinking of my beloved Detroit Lions, if I had to hazard a guess, I bet about 80% of the coverage of the Detroit Lions is negative, and that's because they're a pretty lousy football team. Donald Trump has been a pretty lousy politician, pretty lousy president the first couple months of his administration. Now we're only a couple games into the season, but he's created a lot of problems on himself. He's created a lot of controversies. So he's kind of earned these numbers, in my opinion. He's got plenty of time to turn them around.
Molly.
Well, the media had about this level of coverage in terms of hostility to the president before he was elected, and that speaks to how much people are tuning out negative media coverage, which is actually dangerous because you want a media that can hold powerful people accountable. And when everything is negative, it's very hard to distinguish between legitimate stories, and many of these stories that have been put out that are negative are just completely fake, or they're based on faulty information, or they're based on incomplete information. This is not good for a media to be this hostile, cartoonishly hostile to a president. It just causes people to tune out and not take their news seriously at all.
Okay, panel, stand by if you would. We do have Shepard Smith in New York with an update on that breaking story, the explosion at that concert in the UK. Shep, we'll toss it to you.
Bret, there are multiple confusing reports coming out of Manchester, England. In Manchester, the police are now reporting that there are reports of an explosion at an arena there. We have some pictures that are coming into us now. This was the end of an Ariana Grande concert about 10:40 at night local time there in Manchester, an arena built right on top of a train station. Now authorities report that there are multiple fatalities on scene and a number of injuries, but they will not confirm, Bret, whether there is an explosion or certainly what the origin of that explosion might be. We do know that there was quite a panic of people trying to get out of there. This is the first video that we got in just about 20 minutes or so ago now. But at this moment, Bret, authorities have confirmed nothing except that there are a number of fatalities on scene. There are a number of injuries. Some witness reports indicate this might have been some sort of balloon popping inside, a very loud balloon. At any rate, it caused a stampede. It's backed up the train station. Dozens and dozens of emergency vehicles are now on scene. Sky News in the United Kingdom confirms multiple fatalities on scene, though we don't know how many, and a number of people injured in the sort of stampede, as they've described it, to get out of there. Bret, when we get more information, we'll get it to you. For now, confusion, and a number of people have lost their lives.
We're following this breaking story throughout the night. Shepard Smith in New York. Shep, thanks. We're back with the panel. Steve, we don't know what this is yet, but it does give us, obviously, images that harken back to attacks in different places.
Yeah, it certainly sounds at the very least like it's a tragedy. I think we need to know a lot more. I mean, there's a wide range of possibilities that Shep laid out for us there, whether it was a balloon popping or the possibility that it was some other kind of purposeful attack. There's a lot to learn, but certainly these are scenes you don't want to see ever coming out of a concert like that.
All right, Steve, I want to ask you back to our topic about the stories coming out about this administration as we follow that breaking story. Today, you had other developments. You had Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, not agreeing to